Welcome to this 7th session of our summer series on the book of Revelation. Today we move into Revelation chapter 13 and then 14. And in chapter 13, there is the mention of the mark of the beast. And that, of course, is a reference that has captivated the imagination of people for many centuries. Actually, in Revelation, there are two beasts. The first is the beast of the sea, and I will be speaking about that beast, and then Jesse's going to pick up with the second beast, who's mentioned later in chapter 13. So let's address the question of what would this beast from the sea have meant to the congregation of these churches in Asia Minor, the churches of Pastor John, as we've been calling him, Pastor John of Patmos. The first thing we have to do, really, to put it in context, is to remember what had happened at the end of the previous chapter, chapter 12. The dragon, who represents the evil one, Satan, I guess you could say, has failed in its war with God and with Christ, and so the dragon now turns its evil upon those who are followers of Christ. It's clear that this beast is an embodiment of the Roman Empire. And so how do we know that? Well, here are several references. The description of the beast in chapter 13, the beast of the sea, he has 10 horns, there's reference to leopard, bear, and that really is a direct adaptation of a vision that happens in the 7th chapter of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. And these, in that reference, there are 4 beasts who come out of the sea. Each of those 4 is identified in Daniel as being specifically related to an empire that wars against the people of God. The sea beast of Revelation chapter 13 is kind of a mashup of all of these 4 beasts, and so he is the ultimate beastly kingdom. And at the end of the first century, that ultimate kingdom would have been the Roman Empire. There's some further validation that's found later in Revelation in the 17th chapter, where there's identification of the city that's on 7 hills. That's still used to refer to Rome today. So there's that reference in chapter 17 that kind of harkens back to chapter 13 as well. Here are a few other characteristics that fit the first century experience of the Roman Empire. The fact that the beast is from the sea, that these cities where the churches are in Asia Minor, the dignitaries from Rome, the emperor or other rulers, governors, armies, would have come to these cities of Asia Minor via the sea. There's mention there in early in chapter 13 of the mouth uttering blasphemies against God. And what had happened, let's say, between early in the first century when Jesus was on earth, when Paul was on earth, what has happened in those intervening decades is that the Roman emperor, who was always considered to be ruler and really kind of godlike, all of that, those accolades that were given to him really had escalated decade by decade by decade. And so by the time 90 or 100 years have passed, here is Domitian probably was on the throne at that time, and he was called Lord and God. And that Lord and God was actually inscribed on coins of the Roman Empire. And so these expressions of blasphemy would pass from hand to hand. And this was representative of how the whole culture was worshiping the Roman emperor and calling him Lord and God, when, of course, the church would say there's only one Lord and one God and only one Jesus Christ who is worthy of worship. And since those who read this are being called out of giving obeisance to the Roman Empire, he's showing how they participate in it just by virtue of making use of the currency and giving, and in fact worshiping the emperor by the use of the currency. There's an interesting reference in verse 3, and there's a reference there of one of the dragon's heads appeared to have suffered a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And that probably refers to the Emperor Nero, who had committed suicide earlier by stabbing himself in the throat with a sword, but rumors still persisted that he was alive. And in a sense, this is a kind of a parody, if you will, on Jesus' death and resurrection. Nero reported to be alive, but definitely not alive, whereas Christ was dead and is alive. So I'll stop there and now turn it over to Jesse, who will talk about the beast on the land.
Brian Blunt, whose book we rely on, whose commentary we rely on for this series, speaks of the importance of two things, the importance of mythology, the beasts, the stories of these beasts, and also of context, as Lib says, that the context being the Roman Empire and the economic juggernaut that the empire had become by this time. And so the beast from the earth, which later is referred to as the false prophet, is described as having two horns like a lamb, but speaking like a dragon. So there is the deception. There's the false prophet, is that it looks like the lamb, but it roars like the dragon. And it exercises all the authority of the first beast, and it enforces emperor worship. It is requiring in verse 12 for all inhabitants to worship the first beast, the beast from the sea. The writing here also makes clear, however, that God is in charge. Even these horrible events going through, in verse 14 we are told that the beast is allowed to perform signs, wondrous signs. And in verse 15, it is allowed to give breath to the image of the first beast. Brian Blunt makes the point that this passive verse here is intentional, is purposeful to make clear that these things happen because God is willing them to happen to bring about God's final judgment. The beast of the earth gave breath to the images of the beast, allowed it to rule, allowed Rome to rule in Asia Minor. And then we come to the mark of the beast, as Lib said, and the purpose of the mark of the beast we see in verse 17, so that no one can buy or sell who does not have the mark. That is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. So to participate in this imperial economy that Rome had built, you had to acquiesce, you had to show loyalty to Rome with this symbol, this mark of the beast, in order even to participate in what Rome has created here in terms of the economic empire. The number, I tried to follow Brian on figuring out what the number is, and I couldn't follow it. But apparently, at least it's his theory, and I think that different scholars have different ideas about it, but that the number of 666 does represent Nero, that if you spell Nero's name in Hebrew and assign numbers to all of those letters, that it comes up with 666. But then he makes another interesting point about that, about 666, and people are required to repeat the name, to bear the name, and he compares that to the perfect number of 7, and says that by calling the beast 666, we are repeating, the people are repeating and emphasizing that he never reaches perfection. He is inferior to God's perfection. And so that's what the recitation of the number of the beast just enforces his inferiority. We move then into chapter 14 and read this. Be seated when you read this. Hang on to your seat, because it's really wild, adventurous stuff that we're doing. But it starts off chapter 14, verse 1. Then I looked. There's a transition that John is using. Then I looked, making clear, bringing us back that these are visions that John is relaying to us. And there was the Lamb. So this is the reappearance. We've seen the Lamb before, but it was a lamb. It was not the Lamb. And now that we've been introduced, we see that this is Christ, the Lamb, standing on Mount Zion. Now, when the child was snatched away from the woman and taken up to heaven, we would expect to see the child enthroned, sitting on a throne and not standing. But the fact that the Lamb is standing indicates what has been testified to repeatedly, and that is that Christ's active resistance to the empire, active witness to the lordship of God. This is not passive. This is not a king seated on a throne and everybody paying homage to the king. This is the Lamb of God testifying even to the point of death, testifying fearlessly and faithfully to the lordship of God. And where is he standing? He is standing on Mount Zion, it says in verse 1. Zion is eschatologically the place where the Messiah assembles the people of God and executes God's final judgment. Brian Blunt points out that Zion appears 19 times in the Old Testament, never quite the exact same geography, but that it is always a reference to a remnant being saved. And so here we have 144,000 gathered with him, who had his name and the Father's name written on their foreheads. And we saw that in an earlier session when they were bearing God's name as witnesses. And now we have assembled two battling forces, those with the image of the number of the beast, the mark of the beast on their heads, and those with the name of the Lamb and the name of God on their heads, ready for an eschatological battle. In verse 3, they sing a new song. What a beautiful expression, a new song. And again, when in the Bible we hear people singing a new song, it is a song of redemption. It's a song of deliverance. They have a new song to sing, new promises to keep. In verse 4, there are people who have abstained from sex, people who have been chaste, and the image here is not for the sake of sexual morality, but for the sake of being ready for battle. They have no distractions, nothing to keep them from the battles that are coming. And then in verse 11, fire and brimstone comes forth, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, it says. There is no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and its image, and for anyone who receives the mark of its name. The message of fire and brimstone here, it's important to remember, is delivered to the believers. This is not a message delivered to the inhabitants of Rome, the unbelievers of Rome, trying to proselytize the people of Rome. It's a message being delivered to the believers and telling them the good news that they are redeemed from the judgment, the final judgment to come in the day of the Lord. Lib?
Okay. Well, in verse 14, the scene changes, and as Jesse's referred to the Lamb, the scene changes, and John now sees one who is like the Son of Man. Or, we kind of bandied that term around, Son of Man, without thinking about what it says, just refers to Jesus, but it really means the child of humanity. So it's a human figure is really what is being said here. It calls to mind other judgment scenes where there's a separation, again, of, you might remember the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25. It refers back to maybe, or it calls to mind at least Mark 13, which is called the Little Apocalypse. But there's a harvest scene there, and that's a reference that kind of occurs both in Daniel 7 and here. And the harvest is of two types. You've got the wheat and you've got the grapes. The wheat are the faithful, the grapes are the unfaithful. And it's, you might remember that we have the wheat referred to maybe in Psalm chapter 1, where the wheat is the good, faithful, and the chaff is like the wind. The chaff is what the wind drives away. So it's saying right here, the times come, the Son of Man is going to directly harvest the wheat, and then there's an angel that's going to harvest the grapes. And we're now on the verge of the judgment. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your comments and seeing you on Sunday.